ESPN College Football Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the ESPN College Football Podcast for Wednesday, June 1st. We are in fact 1 month closer to the college football season, and there's plenty of news to discuss. I'm Adam Rittenberg, joined by my friend and colleague Heather Dinich at the SEC meetings in Florida, and we have a special guest right off the top of the show, Pac-12 Commissioner George Kliavkoff, kind enough to join us from Vegas. I know, George, you've been going around a lot here the last month or so, but we really appreciate you joining us here on the College Football Podcast.
Thanks, Adam. Good to be with you. Hi, Heather.
Hey, thank you so much, George. You know, I feel like we were just together in Scottsdale at your meetings, but now I'm here at the SEC. But you know what? It all ties together, George. It really does, because, you know, we were talking a little bit about you and Greg Sankey's visit to Washington. He mentioned that yesterday. That came up in his press conference. And, you know, I guess that might be a good place to start, just in terms of how realistic you feel NIL help is from the federal government, because every league, it doesn't matter what spring meetings you're at, coaches are lamenting just the chaos of no rules and trying to seek some help. What are your thoughts on where that is?
Yeah, well, I think Greg and I are philosophically aligned on the threat of kind of NIL and the way it's currently structured, and some of the bigger issues that are facing college athletics, particularly the potential employment status of our student athletes that we had an opportunity to discuss with senators. And it's interesting, Greg and I represent parts of the country that are really different politically. So having the two of us visit senators together, I think was helpful. Listen, anytime you're relying on the Congress to solve your business issues, you've started behind the eight ball, right? I mean, that is not the solution that we want, but it's the solution that we have to explore. And I think it's unlikely we get anything done there prior to the midterms, but we have to set the table for conversations after the midterms. I think the better solution is for college athletics to heal itself, for the leaders in college athletics to start figuring out a way to enforce the rules that we've all agreed to, right? No inducement, no pay for play, and quid pro quo, right? The amount paid to a student athlete has to be commensurate with the work that student athlete is doing. If we enforce those three rules, I think we solve our NIL issues.
And how realistic is that, George, to work together and to enforce some of the things that are going on? Because I think there's a healthy dose of skepticism around the country about the ability to enforce, you know, whether it's you with your own league or the other commissioners with their leagues or working together. How realistic is that process?
Well, in the first 9 months of NIL, the NCAA really did not do the enforcement that I think we were expecting. In the last month, they've said they're going to step up their enforcement. We've yet to see anything come out of that, but we take them at their word. I think you have to give them a chance to enforce it. And if they don't, I think some subset of the conference commissioners are going to have to get together and decide to enforce it ourselves.
One of the other topics here at SEC Media Days is whether or not to go to 8 or 9 conference games when Oklahoma and Texas join the league. You know, the Pac-12 recently, I think it was maybe 4 minutes after the NCAA changed its rule, decided to scrap divisions, 3, 7, somewhere around there. But it was very, very quickly after the NCAA said, you guys can run your conference championship games how you feel fit, that you guys changed your format. How did that decision come about, and what are you really hoping to gain from that? Do you hope other conferences follow?
Well, for us, it was the right thing to do. And it took us exactly 6 minutes after the NCAA tweeted out the decision. But we were anticipating the decision because we had been doing work for months before to make sure that decision came out the right way and actually allowed each conference to decide how to structure its own championship game. You know, this is a 4-year decision for us. It's a decision that lasts the balance of the current CFP structure. We did it to optimize our chances of getting CFP invitations. In 5 of the last 11 years, we would have had different teams playing in our championship game and higher ranked teams and better teams. And we thought that was important. So we lobbied in the background for a long time to get the rule changed. And we had run it by and got unanimous support from our coaches, unanimous support from our athletic directors, and then eventually unanimous support from our board of directors, so that we would be prepared when the rule was changed for us to move away from having our two division winners playing our championship game and instead just take the two teams with the highest conference winning percentage, which for us traditionally has been our two best teams.
George, as you look around the country, if more leagues do this, what could it do to college football's postseason from a championship game standpoint and even from a future expanded playoff standpoint to have no divisions and most championship games structured the same way around the country?
Well, I think every conference will have to make its own decision. When you think about why you have divisions, historically it's been because we have this rule that either you have to play a full round robin or you have to be in divisions and have the two divisions winners play in your championship game for that championship game to not count as your 12th game, to be able to free it up to be the 13th game. And we didn't think it was right for that rule to be in place. We thought the conferences should get to make their own decision about who plays in their championship game. Again, for us, we're optimizing for CFP invitations, and we anticipate that the playoffs are going to expand starting in 26. And depending on what the expansion looks like, we will make a different decision about who plays in our championship game once we know what that format looks like.
So what gives you the confidence to say that you anticipate it's going to expand in 26?
I think it's the right thing for college football. I think it's the right thing for the sport and for the student athletes. And I think calmer minds will eventually prevail. And I think we are really, really close, in my opinion, to an expanded format. At the margins, we have a few issues we have to work through, but I think we're going to work through those issues. I don't think someone's going to stand in the way of expansion over what I consider to be minor issues.
George, you're in the room with the other commissioners. What is the vibe like, especially, since the decision was made not to expand before the end of the current contract? Greg Sankey has made his frustrations known several times about not getting there, but what's that the mood like, and just your confidence in the ability to work together towards something that can work for everyone as a whole instead of just for this league or these two leagues?
Yeah, now that we've kind of taken a pause and said we're not trying to get it done in time for the current contract cycle, I think it's a better mood. I think people are thinking more long-term and what's in the best interest of college football. I think in the moment, we put ourselves in a bind. Last June, a format was announced that was not approved by everyone that needed to approve it. And that creates kind of tension because the folks that came up with that format kind of dug their heels in and said, this is the format. And those of us who were not in the room said, well, you didn't think about this and you didn't think about that. And that creates unnecessary tension. I think the best thing to do is, for us to get in the room, focus on 26 and beyond, come up with a solution that's good for college athletics, and then announce it as opposed to do it in the other order.
One of the topics that came up here in Destin is an SEC-only playoff, which Sankey said yesterday is filed away in a folder. Basically, he said it was one of about 40 plans, scheduling models that they were talking about. And it all circled back to the fact that there currently is not anything in place in 2026 as far as the playoff. And the question is, does that concern you? He said that he's not using that as a negotiating tactic. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, listen, there are a lot of sports where the NCAA dominates in those sports. There are sports where we've won every single NCAA championship. And the idea that instead of playing everybody else, we would expand our conference championship, and then declare ourselves the national champion because we won our conference, seems to me to be a silly idea. Again, I think what we need to do is get in the room, figure out what's best for college football. We will come to an agreement, and then we will announce the agreement. I think any discussion prior to that of particular formats or crazy ideas seems to me to be posturing and unnecessary.
George, I'm always interested in your perspective as someone who spent his career on the outside. and then entering this landscape of where things have been done a certain way for a while, and then there's so much change in the environment right now. Just generally, what's that been like for you to kind of exist in one decision-making environment, and then now you're in a different one where I think we could all agree sometimes decisions take a lot longer than I think a lot of people would like to actually get made?
Well, the length of the decision-making process doesn't bother me because it's collaborative, and I think that's healthy. I do think that there are certain things about college athletics that I'm still trying to figure out, right? I've talked about it a lot, but this idea that we schedule football games 12, 13, 14 years in advance seems silly to me. It seems like there's a way to solve for that, and we're working on solutions for that. It seems kind of, not very progressive to be announcing deals before they're approved by everybody that needs to approve them, and candidly inconsistent with the way historically we've done things in college athletics, from my understanding of the history. And it just seems like we can be more collaborative, and I think because of what's happening in college athletics, all the big issues that are going on at the same time, and some of the leadership changes that have just occurred or are about to occur, that we have kind of this generational, unique moment in time opportunity to reset college athletics and to do things the right way. And I think part of that will be to continue the historic collaborative nature of the way that we do stuff.
So we are in this 4-team system for 4 more years, and Utah and Florida have this incredible matchup in the season opener. And I'm going to be one of those people who's putting way too much into that game, because I would like to be talking about a playoff contender beyond the first week. And, not to say that Utah can't lose that game, but George, Utah can't lose that game.
We have several teams that I think are playoff contenders. As you know, we've got Oregon traveling to Atlanta to play Georgia. That afternoon, that evening in Gainesville, we'll have Utah playing Florida. We've got lots of other teams that are playing big first, second, third week games, a lot of cross-divisional games. I'm really excited about it. I'm not going to speculate on someone's playoff contention after one game. I do know that historically, with the kind of playoff invitational that we have, I don't even call it a playoff. We have kind of one-loss opportunities, but when you get to a second loss, historically, no team has made it. So I think that sets the boundaries for how we think about a 4-team invitation.
That also puts so much pressure, though, on teams to have such good seasons. How far away do you think the Pac-12 is, in all seriousness, from getting back into this thing as the current system exists?
I'm an optimist. I think we're going to get teams in this year.
I love the optimism, George. And I think Utah is a team that people don't pay enough attention to, not just last year, but historically what Coach Whittingham and his staff have done over the years. It just seems like a team that struggles to get its due at times. I did want to go back to, what we were talking about at first with NIL, because when we were together in Arizona about a month ago, you outlined kind of the second part of this, which is what's been termed as the existential threat of athletes becoming employees at universities. Just for our listeners, why does that not work? What is so problematic with that type of model? If it gets closer to that you and certainly your colleagues around college athletics want to resist?
Well, we may get to that model, and I think everybody's preparing in case we get to that model, but it's not the preferred model. And I'd outline just some kind of things that are obvious to me if we end up making our student athletes employees, or being told that our student athletes are employees. If they're employees, they're probably not pursuing the academic model, right? They're probably very focused on their sport to the exclusion of academics. And if you just think about the student athletes in kind of our 2 biggest revenue sports, football and men's basketball, you've got a model where the vast majority of those student athletes are not going to play professionally. More than 95% are not going to play professionally. So maybe they get paid a little bit of money while they're in school, but they won't be getting the degrees that set them up for life the way they are today. And that's a real problem. You also think about those student athletes, particularly in those sports. I'm unaware of any professional sports model that allows the athlete to decide what team they play for. In professional sports, you have draft models. And you can imagine in an employee status model, you're going to have student athletes coming out of high school told what college team drafted them. And you can go play for that team or not play college athletics. And of course, if you're a professional athlete playing for one of those schools, you're subject to being traded. You're subject to being fired if you're not as good as the coach thought you were when they drafted you. So there'd be no caps on the number of hours per week that the student athlete would be engaged in their sport. There'd be all sorts of issues. Again, all this would be collectively bargained, but it's not good for those student athletes. And then you layer on top of that those are the two sports that drive the revenue that is primarily used to support all of the other sports in college athletics. And you'd end up losing scholarships in other sports. I think in the Pac-12, back of the envelope, we probably lose 5,000 of our 7,000 scholarships. And those sports, I don't know if they'd go away or be supported otherwise, but the money that we use today from football and basketball to support those sports would not be there anymore, arguably. And of course, that means less educational opportunities for the majority of our student athletes, candidly, the majority of our minority student athletes as well. And in addition to that, you would be undermining the unique Olympic preparation movement that we have in the United States. We're the only country in the world where universities actually provide the development camps for the Olympics. In every other country, it's kind of sponsored by the state, and there are Olympic development training camps. We don't have that. We do that at the university level, and it would decimate the Olympic movement, so much so that the CEO of the USOPC, Sarah Hirschland, actually joined Greg Sankey and I for our meeting with Senator Cantwell in DC a couple of weeks ago. And that's a real issue. It's also quite a bipartisan issue, right? No senator wants to be the senator that did not stop the destruction of the Olympic movement. So a lot of issues. Will it go that direction? Don't know. Preparing in case it does. Hoping it doesn't, candidly.
George, I obviously one of the items that's being discussed right now that isn't getting as much attention because of everything else going on is just media rights, and it's always a big topic. I know for every commissioner, the Big Ten is close to its new media rights agreement. The Pac-12 will be the next in line. How much do you think about that, and where do you think things are going just in the future nationally with these agreements in terms of length, in terms of partnership, and in terms of how college fans are going to be getting their content in the future?
Yeah, listen, I think college athletics is one of the most undervalued sports properties in the world, and nothing's more valuable right now in media than live sports rights. And we're in a unique position because unlike the other conferences, we've made decisions in the past that allow us to be in a place now where we own 100% of our media rights, right? We haven't sold a portion of our tier 2 and tier 3 rights to a network where we've given up equity. We own everything. I think, we're going to have shorter terms on media rights deals because of how quickly everything is developing. But I love the position we're in, and we're actually rooting hard for the Big Ten because they're going to set the standard on what the value of these rights are. And I think there's going to be a lot of bidders for each tier of our rights. I anticipate that our tier 1 rights will continue to be on linear television. I think that's still the broadest appeal, the broadest reach. And we're going to have dedicated windows and make sure that everyone can get access to that content in traditional ways. I think our second tier and third tier content stuff that today is on our Pac-12 networks. We're going to continue to produce that content because we think that there's power in being the own producer of our content, but that'll be distributed in different ways, I believe. And that distribution could include digital platforms or other platforms. And one of the things I want to make sure of is that we balance 3 things. Number 1 is revenue. Number 2 is broad distribution. And number three is some flexibility, so that if we have a team that's lined itself up for a NCAA tournament invitation, or a student athlete that has a potential Heisman Trophy vote going on, that we get to showcase those teams and those players in time periods where everyone in the country can watch us. So we'll balance those three things. But one of my core kind of tenets when we're thinking about doing these media rights deals is I want our content to be viewable to anyone that wants to watch it on any piece of glass connected to the internet. Whether that's a television or a tablet or a phone, I just want broad distribution.
George, last question for you is, with all of these things going on and so many issues that you guys are dealing with, what do you want to see college athletics look like 5 years from now, whether it's structurally or government-wise? What do you hope it looks like?
Yeah, so the first for me is that we support broad-based programming. I took this job because I think the mission of protecting and expanding scholarships is so important, providing educational opportunities to folks that otherwise wouldn't have it. So for me, whatever creates the most scholarships is kind of top priority. At the same time, I think we can do a lot better for our student athletes. I think the Pac-12 leads in taking care of the mental and physical and other kind of health issues related to student athletes and taking care of their well-being, but I think we can do better. And I think that this is going to become a bigger and bigger business, because I think our rights are undervalued. And I would like to see us use some of that expanded capital to do a better job of taking care of our student athletes. And I think there are ways we can do that. And we're ready, in partnership with other conferences, to commit to doing that.
It's a very dynamic and exciting time, George. I just realized this is your 11th month anniversary of being on the job, and quite a almost year it's been. But we certainly appreciate your time joining us here on the ESPN College Football Podcast, and wish you well here this summer as so many things are going on.
Well, Adam and Heather, thank you for all that you guys do to cover our sports and to cover our athletes. We really appreciate it.
Before we move on, I want to point you to another podcast on ESPN's roster of shows. First Take, Her Take. Elle Duncan, Charlie Arnold, and Kimberly A. Martin are dropping new episodes every Wednesday, talking everything from self-affirmations to the NBA playoffs. Follow First Take, Her Take wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow the show on TikTok at First Take, Her Take Podcast. And check out the latest entry in ESPN's Emmy Award-winning 30 for 30 documentary film series, The Greatest Mixtape Ever. It's the story of how a series of street ball videos set to music in the 90s transformed basketball's place in the culture, defined the lives of the players who starred in them, and changed the game itself forever. Stream now on ESPN+. And listen to the companion 30 for 30 podcast, A Street Ball Mixtape, exploring the essence of street ball through a collection of legendary stories. Listen now on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Great conversation there with Pac-12 Commissioner George Kliavkoff. Heather, I know he's one of our favorites just to talk to because of his perspective and, being very direct on certain things, including, what he called a silly idea, the SEC starting its own playoff potentially, although that it didn't seem as likely yesterday as it did maybe last week. But what were your biggest takeaways from our conversation with George, whether it was on the playoff, his thoughts on NIL, or the potential dangers of athletes as full-time employees? Certainly media rights is another thing he discussed at length with us.
Well, two things. One, my ears perked up when he said that he thought the playoff was going to expand for 2026. And I say that because, they've been talking about it for a really, really, really long time now. And I've heard that, and I'm sort of in, I believe it when I see it type mode. I mean, I think it is going to expand, but he just seemed very positive and upbeat about it. And I do think that the time off has helped some of these guys sort of step back for a minute. But Sankey's still upset about it. This is why that all SEC playoff is even a topic of conversation, because as he stood up in front of reporters yesterday and said, there is nothing right now for 2026, nothing. And so his perspective is what he called the proverbial blue sky approach. Let's see what we can do. But like I said, he said it's tucked in a folder. To me, it's not that realistic. I have spoken to people who have said they would be shocked if Greg Sankey at the end of the day went through with that. But if the other commissioners were to come up with a playoff that he vehemently opposed, that's where you get that slim chance of maybe the SEC going off and doing its own thing.
Right. So it's almost like a game of chicken, like who's going to come off their position a little bit, because you heard a little bit from Kevin Warren, the Big Ten commissioner, about his desire for automatic qualifiers. Jim Phillips doesn't see ACC commissioner is almost in a place where he's not, his mind isn't even there yet because there's so many other things going on right now. I think Greg Sankey would be resistant or has been resistant to any 8-team models, at least any 8-team models with reserved spots for conference champions or for a group of 5 participants. So what gives here in your mind, Heather, in talking to these people, being around quite a few of the commissioners here in the last month or so, who has to give the most, who has to give something in order to get to a place where there's more optimism and excitement about what could come in 2026 versus lamenting what didn't happen with this last push for playoff expansion?
Well, my gut answer to that is Kevin Warren has to give up the automatic qualifiers. And I don't know if that will happen or not. But look, as Jack Swarbrick, the athletic director at Notre Dame, told me when this all fell apart, and I asked him why, he said, because when it has to be unanimous, everyone has 100% leverage. And that's so true. Well, now it doesn't have to be 100% unanimous anymore. It has to be, who wants to do this? Let's go play ball. And whoever wants to play can go play. And whoever doesn't have to. I mean, that's the way it is.
And to that point, it's really interesting because George Kliavkoff, before the Pac-12 championship game, brought up that very idea that, in the future, the approval process may just be a simple majority or a supermajority instead of a unanimous process or a unanimous vote needed to change the model. And so we go back to the alliance, which everybody is sort of wondering what it is and what the point of it was. If you have a system where the Power 5 all has more power than the Group of 5, which I think most of the Power 5 commissioners think is necessary, and then you have 3 that are aligned on their thinking, what does that mean for the SEC? Could that push them closer to doing their own thing? What does it mean for the Big 12? We don't know who the next Big 12 commissioner is going to be. And so that voting process and approval process for whatever the future likely expanded playoff is, I think is a really interesting nugget here that fans need to be aware of.
Well, Adam, I feel like that in part goes back to what Kliavkoff was talking about in regards to the media rights deal. Once the Big Ten announces its blockbuster deal, the Pac-12 then follows. How does that contribute to these conversations? Because I do think it is such a big part of it, and it's a big piece of the puzzle. It's amazing to hear George say, I'm rooting for the Big Ten hard in this. And I think that in itself provides answers.
Yeah. And again, I've been a proponent for many years of getting rid of divisions in college football. I think the ACC was the first to propose the idea, which again, this NCAA rule changed recently, but this came up, I think, back in 2014 or 2015 for the first time. And there was varying degrees of resistance around the sport. And I think, to your point about the Big Ten being tied to the automatic qualifiers, I think that position changes or likely changes dramatically, if and when the Big Ten gets rid of divisions and ensures that its championship game is pitting 2 teams that I can't imagine wouldn't be part of the 12-team playoff if they win. In most years, both of them would be in kind of regardless of the result. But keep in mind, they are doing a media negotiation right now. They want their championship game to be as attractive as possible to those media partners in that negotiation. And so to take a position saying, we want, no matter what happens with the playoff, we want our champion to be part of it, it's understandable. I just wonder if that position relaxes at all once the media agreement is done, which it should be in the next few months, and once divisions are out of the way. Because you go back and look at the Big Ten championship game, there are very few, if any, years where the winner of that game wouldn't be in a top 12.
to bring it back to the SEC here, where I'm at, I'm curious to see where they wind up going, because the topic of conversation here is 8 or 9 games. And that's for when Oklahoma and Texas join. And part of that has to do with what does the college football playoff look like? Because if it's only 4 teams, there's a line of thinking, hey, let's stick with 8 because it's less margin for error. And you don't have that other conference opponent, which probably going to be a ranked opponent, right, to worry about. And if it does expand, the 9 games make sense because coaches feel like they can lose 2 games and still get in this thing. I mean, Greg Sankey has said ad nauseum, I'm okay with 4 in a 4-team playoff. And I believe him, but I think when Oklahoma and Texas actually join the league, and reality sets in, you have too many good teams and you need a 12-team playoff. I don't see why it makes 0 sense to me why, if you are a 16-team conference, you wouldn't want a bigger playoff to get your teams in, especially with 2 teams the quality of Oklahoma and Texas.
A bigger playoff and more games. I mean, you know, I have made it very clear on this podcast over the years and on any other platform that I don't like the SEC schedule model. And so I'm encouraged that they are interested in playing each other more, because that's what you should do as a league. It's good for the fans. It's good for the players. It's good for the media partners. It may not be as great for the coaches because more of them are going to lose games and more of them are going to get fired, but who cares? It's good for enough people, and it's good for the sport to have a schedule model where you know, every athlete that goes through 4 or 5 years is going to play every other team in the league. The way it's set up now is again, it does not serve the fans of the SEC. I don't know if they care about it enough, but I think they should, because there's an opportunity with that. I think it's the 6 and 3 model that they're discussing. You're having those 3 protected games and 6 rotating games. That's awesome. That's more exciting SEC content. We should all be rooting for that. And I really hope that they settle on that format versus staying with 8. I don't think 8 games serves anybody other than maybe the coaches who can keep their jobs a little bit longer. But I think everybody in this sport should be playing the highest number of acceptable conference games, which appears to be 9. So I certainly hope they go in that direction. Heather, you are in Destin though, and the big story in college football the last couple of weeks has involved 2 SEC coaches, big time guys. Both have won national championships, Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher. We saw the seating chart at the coaches meeting on Tuesday, which I guess they were sitting opposite each other with some other folks around them, other coaches. I'm sure it's very entertaining for Lane Kiffin and others in that room. But what have you heard from Nick Saban? I don't know if Jimbo Fisher has spoken just yet, but what has the dynamic been like around the SEC in the wake of Jimbo Saban Gate 2022?
Wow, I don't even know where to begin. So Saban, I don't want to say he backtracked or walked back, but I would say tampered down a little bit his comments when he met with reporters yesterday. And Kiffin came out of the meeting and told reporters that it was probably a lot calmer in there than most of us on the outside of the room would expect it to be. I caught Mike Leach getting on the elevator yesterday, and I said, hey, so what's the scoop? What really happened in there? You know, fireworks? And he looked at me, shook his head. He said, no, it wasn't any fun at all. You know, he just kind of downplayed it. It seemed like he was looking for a little action in there too and didn't get it. But, you know, Greg Sankey said, I understand that there's frustrations. That's not a defense of what happened or what played out publicly. But what people are telling me is that he very swiftly made it very clear that he wants them talking about their own teams and their own programs. I am not so sure, and I am not convinced that this rift is gone. So I'm interested to hear Jimbo's side of it because he's speaking to reporters today. I highly doubt that he will provide as much entertainment as he did the first time around. But also just knowing Jimbo and the way he talks and how candid he is and unabashed, he will be the news of the day today, Adam.
Yeah, I thought there's a funny quote from Lane Kiffin about the mood in that room. He said, I think it was Tuesday, somehow our group is more professional in the room together than they are on camera themselves. And he added it that people say things in text message that they don't in person. So it's an interesting situation. A lot of competitiveness in that room, a lot of egos. I think, Heather, it's over for Nick Saban. I don't think it's over for Jimbo Fisher. And I go back to, I think, something you and I may have discussed right after that blow up happened, that a coach who was close to Jimbo told me that, hey, he wanted to get credit for the #1 recruiting class. He sat there in previous years and given Nick Saban his due when they're *1, or given Kirby Smart his due when Georgia's #1. This year, Texas A&M was #1, and yet their celebration or whatever comes with these caveats of, they bought their players through NIL, whereas these other coaches don't have to face that. I am curious, one guy that we just haven't heard very much from or has been almost under the radar, which is incredible to think about, is Kirby Smart, who, by the way, won the national championship last year and has his program positioned to compete for titles in the coming seasons. You did talk to him with other media on Tuesday. What was said from Kirby Smart? What were your impressions just hearing from him?
Well, he downplayed it. He certainly downplayed it. I mean, the first thing I asked him was, how are you guys having these meetings when two of your most high-profile coaches aren't speaking to each other? And he started with, coaches don't talk to each other all the time. And I was like, just stop it. I said, you mean if Nick Saban calls you, you don't answer the phone? Well, we don't talk to each other. All right. So then he said, look, if you guys were to put on the headsets on a Saturday, this stuff would seem like Mickey Mouse to you. And so, again, I even saw him in the hallway this morning, and I went up to him, and he was like, I didn't mean to be rude to your question. And I was like, I know, but this is not normal. And he said, well, that's their story, So there was some downplay of it. But, Eli Drinkwitz, I thought, was really good because he said there were some jokes about it, but he did get serious. And he said, we need to get into the room behind closed doors so that we could talk about this without any fear of what we're going to say about it be public. We need to have an honest conversation. And, Sankey did say that he went in there for an hour or so and talked to them about leadership and the importance of finding solutions to these problems. So again, I don't think, and I think you're right. I think this is more Jimbo than it is Nick. It was very personal. And I'm interested to hear what he says, because I don't think this grudge is going to go away anytime soon.
No, it probably won't. But I think what I was fascinated by, the one common thread that was in both Saban's and Jimbo's comments was this desire to have some type of equal playing field regarding NIL. And just going back to our conversation with Pac-12 Commissioner George Kliavkoff, he outlined, I guess, the dangers of a full-on professional model. The more I think about it, Heather, that would create, if structured correctly, some type of evenness, because you could have a salary cap, you could have max contracts. Everybody would sort of have a similar pool of money, at least at the highest levels of college football. You may not know the answer because you haven't asked all the coaches this, but how many of those SEC coaches would be open to that type of environment? We've heard Lane Kiffin talk about how this has become a professional sport. I'm wondering if that opinion is shared throughout the room, or if most are more in the Saban camp, I guess, of we can have NIL. It's a good thing. We need some control over it.
Well, B is my gut instinct, but you're right. I haven't asked every single one of them about it. But I think so much of the problem is what you can't prove, right? And that's what they're talking about, is so much of this is rumors. Greg Byrne, the Alabama athletic director, just talked about how what happens is coach gets a call saying, hey, this school is going to pay your player so-and-so amount of dollars. What are you going to do? Well, how do you prove the first thing, that this other school is going to pay however much money? So I think that's where there need to be regulations and documentation of exactly what's transpiring. Brian Kelly came out and talked about how much of a problem the boosters are. Let's start there. it's a whole other can of worms that's always been there, right? And that's something that we heard coaches talk about in Scottsdale. Some of this is not new at all. It's simply exacerbated by what's going on.
It is, and it's just interesting to hear even what George had to say about enforcement, and what basically there hasn't been any for the last 9 months. And will there be some that's coming, or will the leagues have to step in on their own? But I think to your point about Brian Kelly, that the coach booster relationship is changing, because there's a real concern among coaches that as more players are induced to come to these schools and receive a lot of money as recruits from boosters, that there's going to be more pressure than ever on coaches to play certain players over others. Why aren't you playing the guy that I'm paying all this money to? And if you don't, assistant coach or even head coach, I'm going to get you out of here. So it's something that we'll certainly be watching as we get into what's really the first full season in the NIL environment. NIL kicked off in July, didn't really impact recruiting this year. It certainly will as we get into the 2022 season. And as we're still in the off season, we are marking our progress every week here on the ESPN College Football Podcast by going through the ABCs of the sport. Today's episode, I feel like, should be brought to you by the letter K, because we had George Kliavkoff on, but instead it's the letter P, Heather. And there are 3 teams in the sport that begin with P, 2 of them in the great state of Pennsylvania, your home state, Penn State and Pitt, the rivals. Although Pitt actually will renew its rivalry with West Virginia this year in the opener. Can't wait for the return of the backyard brawl on a Thursday night in Pittsburgh. Also Purdue, a team that was a surprise breakthrough last year under Jeff Brom in the Big Ten West, won a bowl game against Tennessee, returns a really good quarterback in Aiden O'Connell. Heather, let's start with Pitt, because they won the ACC last year. They had their best season under Coach Pat Narduzzi, but unfortunately they've been the subject in the offseason, like many teams, because they lost a great player. Jordan Addison, the Blitnikoff Award winner at wide receiver, ends up transferring from Pitt to USC. So what's next for Pitt? What do you think they do as a follow-up after winning a conference that had been dominated by Clemson throughout the CFP era? Is there any type of encore left in Pitt?
I'm going to say yes, because I think Pat Narduzzi is a very good coach. And I think that's evidenced by what they've been able to do to this point. And also, by the way, the Coastal Division is always up for grabs in the ACC. So it's anybody's game. But I will say this. When Addison left, I was like, ooh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, honestly, my confidence in them went down a couple notches. And I mean, that's one of those things where, like, how do you replace that guy? You don't just do it in a couple of months, right? You have to have somebody step up. And the person who usually steps up is usually not the next Blitnikoff Award winner. Let's be realistic, right? So I don't know. And I think one of the other things, too, is, I've talked to Narduzzi about how he uses the transfer portal and how he got Keaton Slovis. And so much of it is on FaceTime and the players that he's trying to get in there, and just his mentality and the way he thinks about team. And that's something that coaches here are talking about, that people don't talk about. You and I talked about this, the transfers in the locker room. Kiffin talked about this yesterday, I think it was. I mean, you just assume that because you get a boatload of transfers, things are going to work out. Well, I don't know. Just because you have a lot of talent doesn't mean it all meshes together. I mean, that intangible in the locker room, I keep going back there. USC is going to be a fantastic experiment in that regard. But I think that Pat tries very hard to get players that fit his program, as opposed to he's not going to get the Jordan Addison from some other place, right? But he's going to get people that will play their butts off for him.
No doubt. Absolutely, Heather. And that's why Pat Narduzzi keeps getting contract extensions at Pitt, and why he's one of the highest paid coaches in the ACC. One last P reference here, and that's Penn State, which I think is at a really important time in its program trajectory under James Franklin, who received a massive contract late last season. This is a program that had 3 top 10 finishes between 2016 and 2019, including a Big Ten championship and a Rose Bowl appearance in 2016. Since then, it's been a different story, 11-11. They have recruited fairly well, including Drew Aller, who comes in as a dynamic, true freshman quarterback. Sean Clifford is back as a veteran QB. They have a new defensive coordinator in Manny Diaz. But after Michigan won the Big Ten in 2021, I think Penn State needs to figure out, are they going to be competing with Ohio State and maybe Michigan, or are they more in that third or fourth place position? Certainly not what James Franklin wants, not what Penn State wanted in signing him to that long deal. So really, really interesting year, a critical year coming up for the Nittany Lions as well. So that wraps up our P section. Q is up next. So producer Taylor has his work cut out for him. Not too many Q teams in college football, but I'm sure there'll be something for you to chew on next week on the College Football Podcast. That's going to do it for this week's edition. Wanted to thank Heather Dinich, who was braving the different rooms in Destin at the SEC meeting to still be with us here on the podcast. Certainly Pac-12 Commissioner George Kliavkoff. Wanted to thank Taylor and Sarah, as always, for helping us out, and especially thank you for listening to us here on the ESPN College Football Podcast.